I want to say to the state of Alabama.
Yes, sir.
Today I want to say to the people of America and the nations of the world that we are not about to turn around.
Yes, sir.
We are on the move now.
Anthony Grooms, that's me, and I am a child of the Civil Rights Movement, born in 1954, just a few months after Brown v. Board. I grew up in de facto segregation, was a part of the school integration programs of the 1960s and early 70s. And I'm an artist, a literary writer, reader, a professor of creative writing and literature, cultural studies. What inspired me to write Bombingham is a little bit complicated. It begins with the idea that I am a trained fiction writer with an MFA and looking for stories to write and drawing on, as many writers do, on my own background, my own history, and that is, again, being someone who grew up during a period of great social change, the Civil Rights Movement, and also the Vietnam War. I grew up in Central Virginia, and then as a young man moved to the Deep South, to Atlanta, Georgia, and married a woman from Bombingham, Alabama. So I became connected then very strongly with Birmingham through the folk, through my wife's family. And I think that's really what made the difference, because now I was not looking at Birmingham through the eyes of journalists or historians, but really looking at the Birmingham movement through the eyes of my wife's family and their friends, hearing stories about what went on during the 1963 period in particular. And so I began to construct short stories at first about that were based in Birmingham, set in Birmingham, and then moved on to the longer work, the novel Bombingham. Bombingham is a term used by African Americans to refer to Birmingham. Most people are familiar with the very famous 1963 church bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 girls. But the fact of the matter is that that was somewhere like number 60 or 70 of bombings that had occurred in Birmingham, Alabama since the end of World War II. So something in that 15-year period, something on the order of 15-year period between the end of World War II and 1970, something on the order of 15 bombings or something a year. So, and house burnings, etc. So even in Virginia, where I grew up, and in my mind very, very far away from Birmingham, Alabama, the city was referred to as Bombingham. Thus, when I wrote my novel, I thought about that term as it applies to Birmingham, but also as it applies to other places where there is civil strife and violence. Bombinghams really are everywhere in the world. I think that, my humble opinion, that lots of people should read Bombingham, not just Washingtonians. But of course, Washington is a very special city. It is the nation's capital. And it is a city with a large African American and progressive population. And I think these issues that we talk about in when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, and particularly now celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham movement, which was so pivotal in the Civil Rights Movement, these issues are still with us. So we go to the Supreme Court even today as I talk, and there is a case involving voting rights. And here in Atlanta, people are referencing the civil rights movement. We're building museums all over the country, including Washington, D.C., that might reflect on the civil rights movement. Just recently, in fact, a large monument to Martin Luther King. So in fact, the events of 50 years ago are very, very much with us today. One of the things that happened, I think, is that people began to mythologize around the events. They kind of forget what actually happened and replace it with a more idealized characterizations of what happened. That everybody on one side was brave and everybody on the other side was evil. But in fact, life, as we know, is more complicated. And novels are a good way to get some insight into the emotional truth of these historical events. When John Kennedy proposed the '64 Civil Rights Bill, he said to Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin Luther King, "But for Birmingham, we wouldn't be here today." So even then, that happened in late 1963, he recognized that what happened in Birmingham in May of '63 was pivotal in making social change in the United States. And what happened was that the citizens, ordinary citizens, and in particular children, marched in the streets, were attacked in the streets by their own civil servants, the police and firemen, and that photographs of this were taken, film was taken, and this kind of concrete image of what segregation was all about and what the resistance to segregation was all about suddenly spread across the country, through the media, and across the world. As it spread across the world, we see, for example, the Soviet-controlled newspaper Pravda, with a big picture of a young woman in Birmingham being hosed, essentially asking the question, is this American democracy? So the United States, as the champion of democracy, is very embarrassed in the context of the Cold War. And thus, I think Birmingham was very, very pivotal in facilitating the change that came. I think that all history is relevant. We never escape it, even history much older than 50 years ago, and certainly history is older than 12 years ago. This book, I think, has relevancy, not only because this is the 50th anniversary of the Birmingham movement, and the 50th anniversary of a very, very pivotal year in American history, 1963, is both a year of triumph and tragedy, not only in the context of the civil rights movement, but in other realms too. For example, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Well, Bombingham, I think, has been successful in reaching audiences, particularly high school, college audiences. It is a way in which younger readers can rediscover, in a sense, or at least discover this history that is a little bit older than them. For people my age, it is a touchstone to that very important time in the life of the nation.